Jamie Lloyd froze, tears staining her face. An involuntary sound, a soft, broken, huh, escaped her lips as she nodded, her perception tilting as if she were floating near the ceiling. The shock was a physical thing, a thick, muffling blanket wrapped around her soul. The screams were trapped inside her, leaving only a hollow, ringing silence. He's gone. The thought didn't feel like her own. It was a fact, as cold and absolute as a headstone. She didn't remember walking out of the station. One moment she was in the house of the dead. The next she was on the cracked asphalt, the night air cold on her skin. The wind didn't sound like wind anymore. It was a low, whispering keen, a chorus of the leaves telling her where to go. She was in a daze, a sleepwalker pulled by an invisible string. It led her to the cemetery, on the hill overlooking Haddonfield. The gates were open, a dark maw. And there, in the oldest section, where the angels were worn featureless by time, she saw him. Michael Myers stood before a fresh, raw mound of earth, a grave dug for no one. He was a monolith of pure shadow against the deeper black of the night. He did not move like a man, but like a machine winding down. His head, the featureless white mask, was tilted slightly, as if listening to a voice only he could hear. From the belt of his coveralls, he drew a long, heavy knife, the same one that had carved its way through so many lives. Jamie watched, her breath frozen in her lungs. This was not an escape. This was a ritual, with a slow, deliberate force that was more terrifying than any of his previous violence. He placed the tip of the blade against his own chest. There was no hesitation. He drove the hilt upwards, under the rib cage, a butcher's stroke. A sound escaped him then, not a cry of pain, but a long, slow exhalation, like steam from a dying engine. And then, the impossible. His head did not just fall. It separated, tumbling from his shoulders in a grotesque, bloody arc. It hit the soft earth of the grave with a dull, wet thud, the mask staring blankly at the starless sky. The body remained standing for a heartbeat longer, a headless obelisk, before collapsing in a heap of lifeless cloth and flesh. Jamie felt the world tilt. The ghost story was real. She had seen the monster not just die, but unmake itself. A figure emerged from behind a large marble cross. The man in black. He walked to the grave, looked down at the severed head, and then at the headless body. He made a note on a small pad. Then, he picked up the mask, wiping the blood from its blank eyes, with a clinical swipe of his glove. He looked directly at Jamie, his own face hidden in shadow, and gave a single, slow nod. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was an acknowledgement, a passing of the torch. As he vanished back into the darkness, Jamie finally stumbled forward. She stood at the edge of the grave, looking down at the thing that had been her uncle. The body was already looking less like a man and more like a discarded shell. But the evil wasn't in the flesh. She understood that now. It was in the mask the man in black had taken. It was in the soil of Haddonfield. It was in the hollow, ringing space he had carved inside of her. She didn't sob. The despair had gone too deep for that. It had crystallized into a cold, certain knowledge. Michael Myers was gone, but the shape remained. And as she stood alone in the cemetery, the first frigid drops of rain beginning to fall, Jamie Lloyd knew, with a terror that was utterly calm, that it was her turn to wear it. The world had become a watercolor painting left in the rain. Colors bled into one another. The sharp edges of reality, the curb of the sidewalk, the bark of a tree, were softened, blurred. Jamie Lloyd moved through Haddonfield not as a girl, but as a wisp of thought, a forgotten sigh on the night air. The shock was a cocoon. It muffled the sounds of the few distant cars, turned the streetlights into hazy golden moons. She was walking, but she didn't know where. Her body was simply carrying her away from the cemetery, from the impossible thing she had witnessed. It was then she saw the first ghost. It was a woman, pale and translucent, rising slowly from a park bench like steam. She didn't look at Jamie. Her head was tilted back, her eyes closed, as she drifted upward, weightless, into the indigo sky. Jamie watched her ascend, feeling no fear, only a hollow recognition. Yes, she thought, that's how it feels, to be unmoored. She walked on, her sneakers making no sound on the pavement. In the yard of a darkened house, a great pine tree stood sentinel. As she passed, she saw a man nestled in its high branches, curled like a sleeping child. He was made of the same silver mist as the woman. One of his arms was missing, the spectral substance fading into nothing at the shoulder. He was humming a tuneless song that Jamie felt more than heard, a vibration in the marrow of her bones. They were just there, the unquiet dead of Haddonfield. Not threatening her, just existing alongside her, their pain as much a part of the town's fabric as the cracked concrete and the rusting playgrounds. They were the echoes Michael had left behind, and now that he was gone, the silence was loud enough to hear them. The thumping bass found her first. It was a physical pressure in the air, a deep, synthetic heartbeat that vibrated up through the soles of her shoes. It came from a building wedged between a closed bookstore and a tax office, a place called the Vale. A line of people, shimmering and laughing, snaked from the front door. Jamie drifted to the alley beside it, the world of the ghosts and the hollow-eyed man still clinging to her. The club's back door was propped open with a brick, a sliver of industrial light and the smell of stale beer and bleach spilling out. A place for the staff to smoke, to take out the trash. A place for things to slip in unseen. She slipped inside. The noise was a wall. It wasn't music. It was a weapon that bludgeoned the silence in her head. Strobing lights cut the darkness into frantic, disconnected frames. Bodies moved on the dance floor, a single, undulating organism of sweat and joy and oblivion. It was the exact opposite of the cemetery, of the silent house, of the police station. She found a corner booth, its red velvet worn bald in patches, and slid into the shadowed recess. From here, she was a spectator to a ritual she couldn't understand. They were all trying to lose themselves, to feel nothing. She didn't have to try. The nothing was all she had. A young woman looked at her curiously, as if to say, "What is a child doing in here?" She reminded her of Rachel, and Tina flashed in her mind. She stared right through her. The woman wasn't seeing her. She was seeing a girl in a booth. She couldn't see the blood on her hands, the grave dirt on her shoes, the spectral shapes that she knew were still drifting just outside the walls. The strobe light caught the sweat on a dancer's neck, and for a single blinding flash, it was blood. The deep thrum of the synth, for one beat, was the concussion of a blown-out cell door. A girl's ecstatic, thrown-back head was the woman ascending from the park bench. They were all ghosts here, too. They were just ghosts who were still breathing, pretending they weren't already dead. The need to escape was sudden and overwhelming. The noise wasn't drowning out the silence. It was becoming it. A louder, more violent kind of silence. She slid out of the booth, back into the crush of bodies, and pushed her way through, not toward the back door, but out the front, past the bouncer, who gave her a curious glance. She burst out onto the sidewalk. The relative quiet of the night was a shock. The cool air was a baptism. She leaned against the brick wall, gulping it down, the club's heartbeat still thumping in her teeth. She had tried to be among them. She had tried to be normal. But the world inside was just as haunted as the world outside. There was no sanctuary in noise, only a different kind of drowning. A low rumble of thunder rolled in the distance. The storm wasn't just coming, it was answering a call. The first cold drops of rain broke the spell of her days, replacing it with a primal, childlike fear. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees, and it sounded like his breathing. She had to get inside. She found refuge on a street of old, sleeping houses. One, a Victorian with a sagging porch and eyes for windows, seemed to call to her. A back window slid open with a gritty, protesting whine. The house was empty, smelling of dust, damp wood, and forgotten lives. Downstairs, the storm was a living thing. It rattled the window panes, through shadows that lunged and retreated across the floral print walls. Every creak of the old timber was a footstep. Every moan of the wind was a voice. She curled into a ball in a musty armchair, but her heart hammered against her ribs. She was a child again, waiting for the boogeyman. The fear was a taste in her mouth, metallic and sharp. Driven by instinct, she left the living room and moved into the central hallway. It was darker, quieter. A tall, ornate mirror reflected a pale, wide-eyed ghost of her own, and beside it, almost invisible, was a door. It wasn't a normal door. It was a sliver of wood, flush with the wall, with no knob. She pushed, and it gave way with a sigh, revealing a hidden space, a priest hole, a long-forgotten nook just big enough for a person to hide in. Inside, it was pitch black and smelled of dry, ancient peace. The sound of the storm was muffled to a distant hum. Here, the shadows were just shadows. Here, the world could not get in. Exhaustion, more profound than any she had ever known, washed over her. She slid down the wall onto the bare wooden floor, pulling her knees to her chest. In this tiny, secret darkness, she finally felt safe enough to be terrified. But the terror could not reach the core of her. Not here. She didn't dream. She simply fell into a void, a blank space between heartbeats, as the ghost of the storm raged impotently outside her hidden tomb. She slept on the floor, not waiting for morning, but simply waiting. For what, she did not know. First light was not a kindness. It was a pale gray blade slicing through the crack in the secret door, cutting the safe darkness into ribbons. Jamie woke not with a start, but with a slow, dawning horror. The weight of it all, the cemetery, the head, the man in black, the ghosts, crashed back into her, filling the silent hollow the night had provided. The numbness was receding, leaving a raw, aching shore. She pushed the door open and crawled out, her body stiff and cold from the floor. The storm had passed, leaving a washed-out, clean world outside the grimy windows. A world that had no right to look so new. She stood in the hallway of the dead house, the memory of last night's terror now just a stale odor. It was over. He was gone. And yet, the fear was still here, coiled in her stomach, a permanent resident. A single hot tear escaped, tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. She didn't sob. She just let it fall. And into the immense, quiet emptiness of the house, she whispered the only word that fit, the only truth she had left. Fuck! It was soft, a breath of pure, unadulterated defeat, a eulogy for the last piece of her childhood. The world returned to Dr. Sam Loomis as a pressure, a muffled hum. The beep of a heart monitor was a distant metallic pulse. The smell was antiseptic, a failed attempt to scrub away mortality. He was in a white room, a hospital. Memories surfaced like bubbles from a deep, dark sea. The sanitarium, the police station, the shape, relentless in the storm. The feel of the plank in his hands, the jarring impact, over and over. A final desperate exorcism, then the void. A crushing weight in his head, his body turning to stone. He tried to open his eyes, but the lids were heavy, uncooperative. He tried to form a thought, to ask a question, but the words were thick and syrupy in his mind, refusing to take shape. He could feel the presence of a nurse, the rustle of fabric, but her voice was distorted, reaching him as if from the other side of a thick glass wall. He managed to part his lips. A dry, clicking sound emerged. He needed to tell them. He needed to warn them. The evil was not contained. It was out there. It was always out there. A nurse leaned in. "Dr. Loomis, can you hear me? You're safe. You're in the hospital." He focused all his will, a final spark in a dying furnace. The words, when they came, were a slurred, breathy ruin, a profound confession of his failure and his understanding. "It's like," he whispered, the sound lost in the sterile air. "Talking underwater." His eyes closed again. The surface world faded. He sank back into the depths, where the monster still waited, silent and patient, in the dark. The underwater world shifted. A single, fixed point of light pierced the murky depths of Loomis's mind. A small, pale face, framed by dark hair. A child's face, etched with a terror far too old for it. Jamie. The name was a lifeline, a jolt of purpose that cut through the neurological fog. His heart monitor spiked. A nurse, checking his IV, paused. Doctor? His eyelids fluttered, fighting against immense weight. His dry tongue felt like sandpaper. He had to know. He had failed to protect her from the uncle, but he had to know if she had survived the aftermath. Jamie! The name was a ragged exhalation, barely audible. He gathered every shred of his will, his brow furrowing with the strain. His hand twitched on the starch-white sheet. Where's the girl? It wasn't a gentle question. It was a demand, laced with the last dregs of his old frantic energy. The fear in his eyes was not for himself, but for her. Where was she? Was she alive? Was she safe? Or had the darkness already taken its final prize? Jamie walked. There was no destination, only motion. The rising sun did little to warm her. She passed a row of dilapidated storefronts, a pawn shop with grimy windows, a laundromat, and an adult video store, its garish neon sign dark and dead in the morning light. The door to the 30 store swung open, and a man stepped out. He was tall, lanky, moving with a tired, graveyard shift slouch. He wore a stained jacket and was lighting a cigarette, his face pale and puffy with exhaustion. There was nothing overtly threatening about him. He was just a man leaving a miserable job after a long night. But Jamie froze. Her breath hitched. It wasn't his appearance, it was his stillness. The way he stood on the curb, not looking for a car, not heading home, but just being. He took a long drag of his cigarette and stared out at the empty road with a hollowed-out vacancy that felt familiar. It was the same emptiness she had seen in the shape that walked in her uncle's skin. A cold dread, entirely separate from the fear of last night's storm, trickled down her spine. What if he's one of them? The thought came unbidden, fully formed. What if he works here, in this place of shadows and secrets? And he's waiting? The man flicked his ash, and his eyes, dull and disinterested, swept across the street and landed on her. Jamie didn't wait. She turned and walked quickly, her heart hammering. The feeling was irrational, but it felt truer than anything else in this new, haunted world. It wasn't just about killing. The people Michael chose, the places he went, the sanitarium, the old Myers house. It felt intentional, ritualistic. The word formed in her mind, cold and absolute. Sacrifice. He didn't just kill, he offered them up. To what? To the silence? To the shape in the darkness? To keep the evil alive? If Michael was truly gone, did that mean the hunger was still there, looking for a new hand to wield the knife? Looking at that hollow-eyed man, she wondered if the seeds were already planted everywhere, just waiting for the right kind of darkness to make them grow. The bus stop bench was cold, the metal leaching the last of the morning's frail warmth through her jeans. Jamie sat, a small bag of groceries, a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, resting beside her. The simple, mundane act of buying food had felt like an act from a play, a part she was no longer qualified to perform. Then it hit her. Not a memory, but a sensation, so vivid it stole the air from her lungs. The give, the terrible wet give of the cloth, the flesh, the something deeper beneath. Her small hands, white-knuckled, clenched around the handle of the shears. Once. A grunt of effort, his body jolting. Twice. The heat of his blood, shockingly warm on her cold skin. 3 times. A final desperate punctuation to a sentence that had no end. It wasn't a thought. It was a full-body memory. The weight of him, the smell of him, the sheer, world-shattering violence of it. She had stabbed the boogeyman. She had made him bleed. And in that moment, at the bus stop, she finally understood the true cost. It wasn't just the fear he had inflicted. It was the violence he had drawn out of her. He had forced a 9-year-old girl to meet him in a place of primal, bloody savagery. He had made her a part of his ritual, not just a victim, but a participant. A sob broke from her, sharp and involuntary. Then another. She cried there, in the open, at the bus stop in the middle of a town going about its day. She didn't cry for the people he had killed, or for the family she had lost. She cried for the little girl she had been, who had to pick up a weapon and fight back. She cried for the stain it left, a permanent mark on her soul that no amount of time could ever wash away. The tears eventually subsided, leaving her hollowed out and clean, like a field after a fire. The bus was coming. She could see it in the distance, a growing speck. She could get on. She could go somewhere, anywhere. But as she wiped her face with the back of her hand and picked up her bag of groceries, she knew. Haddonfield was her grave. It was the place where she had both died and been born into this new, painful understanding. Running away wouldn't change that. The memory was in her blood now, as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. The bus hissed to a stop in front of her, its doors folding open with a pneumatic sigh. The driver looked down, waiting. Jamie Lloyd looked at the open door, then back at the town. She took a slow, shaky breath, and then she took a step back. The doors closed. The bus pulled away. She was still here. Fending for herself would be more devastating.